Hello, everybody. I'm Mayor Eric Pappenfuss, and welcome to Spotlight HBG, a new show for a new season here. I hope everyone had a good summer. As you know, over the course of the last year and a half, we did over 50 community conversations live on Facebook and on Channel 20. Fridays at noon, and we decided for the fall to change the format a little bit. We're going to stick with live noon every Friday. But we're going to go in depth, and we're going to have conversations with various people who work for the city of Harrisburg that you at home should know. I have right here on the desk an iPad, and if you leave comments or ask questions via Facebook, I'm happy to try and integrate them into the interviews. So please give us some feedback. And as I say, we will be doing this every Friday at noon. I'm really pleased to say that our first guest is Harrisburg's newest employee, our new Director of Community Relations and Engagement for the Community Services Division of the Harrisburg Police Department, and that's Anna White. Anna, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Before we get into our conversation, one holdover from the last show is we'd like to begin each week with the latest data from BioBot. Now, this is wastewater epidemiology. This is basically measuring the prevalence of COVID in our city by taking samples of the wastewater. There's a graph up on your screen, and we've had a summer hiatus here, and you can see that when we went on summer break, it was looking like we had pretty much defeated COVID and beaten it back. But now we're seeing a spike and a rise in terms of the prevalence of the virus right here in our community. It's back to levels that we saw last fall, certainly not back to the heights of last winter, but it's sobering. And it's a reminder that we all have to be vigilant. Social distancing, masking, and most importantly, getting vaccinated is the way we're going to defeat this virus and get back to some degree of normalcy. You know, we had Arts Fest over the weekend. It was very successful, but I think the thing I'm most proud of for Arts Fest was that we had over 30 new people vaccinated at our free vaccine clinic. And we need to keep spreading the word. It's safe, it's effective. And now with kids back in school and with children not able to be vaccinated, they can still carry the virus and spread the virus. And especially if you're a caregiver for school-age children, you need to get yourself vaccinated. It's free, it's safe, it's easy, and it's available. Harrisburg was the first municipality in Pennsylvania to require the vaccine for employees, and you're starting to see more of a national discussion of that. I'm proud of that decision, but we've got to come together as a city and cut through all the misinformation that's out there and make sure that we stay safe and we keep those numbers not from getting any higher. All right. We're going to turn now to Anna White, our guest, and it's called Spotlight HBG because, you know, we want to take time to really get to know the people we're talking to. Mm-hmm. And so let's start, Anna. Tell me a little bit about growing up and where you grew up and what your sort of formative memories are from that period in your life.
Oh, well, thank you for having me. I am born in New York, and I came over to Harrisburg very early on. So I've been here since the early 90s, when I was about 3 or 4, I believe. Mm-hmm. And I remember my first house being on South 13th Street. So I, just short of maybe 2 addresses, have been in the Allison Hill community for most of the time that I've lived in Harrisburg. So definitely some fond memories of being in the city and just growing up in a time where there was, children playing in the playgrounds and individuals just out and about, community events and things like that. So been here for quite some time, right in this area, and still to this day in the Allison Hill community. So it's kind of coming full circle that when I started, I was in the Allison Hill area, and now in this new position and new kind of space and time for me, I'm still right where I am representing the people, right in the community.
Sure. Did you grow up in a bilingual household?
Yes. So my mother is Dominican and my stepfather is Cuban. So I am bilingual naturally. So yes, had a bilingual upbringing, culturally, having to learn and also sometimes teach, my mother the ways around. So I remember having to walk to the Latino Center. It was called the Spanish Speaking Center at the time. And just having all of those resources, but also trying to learn the city and trying to help her navigate through the city as well. So yes, bilingual family and hoping to kind of instill a lot of that culture into my own 3 children.
Yeah. So you went to Harrisburg High, and what was your experience like at the time with the Harrisburg School District? Because one of the partnerships that we're looking to really reinvigorate under your direction here with the new Community Service Division is the relationship with the Harrisburg School District. What was your own experience like?
So I remember, the elementary schools, the Lincoln, Melrose, and going to those different spaces. And I never got to go to William Penn because I was in the Math Science Academy. So by the time that I guess it was time for me to transition, we had already started with Roland School. I know was picking up. So attended Roland, went to John Harris, and just quiet bookworm, kept to myself, whereas my brother and sister were a little bit more vocal in public. Ran track for a little bit, but mostly just honor society, concert choir, that type of thing. So I was pretty quiet and laid back, but I remember, the Christmas programs and the assemblies, of course, the band, there's nothing like it. So just a regular person experiencing high school with all of the kind of nuances that go on with that.
Now, you just described yourself as a bookworm, so I have to ask, was there a favorite book or thing that you read in high school which sort of helped you? You can think about that question.
Yeah. What I will say, though, is I do remember my English professors and being in AP English and Mr. LeBar and Mr. Baker for sure, and how impactful those teachers were in me loving to write and learning how to write effectively and learning how to use words and being powerful in my delivery. I do remember that. So I think out of all of my experiences, concert choir was impactful for me to kind of learn a skill set that traditionally I thought like in an urban area would give me exposure to that space. But also I really enjoyed those English classes. I mean, not enjoyed at the time, like I was rushing to get assignments done, but in hindsight, realizing how excited and passionate I was about words and messaging and just commitment to being able to deliver messages. I think they were critical in me going into college and furthering that passion and realizing how important words are.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll talk a little bit about the way you have with words and your consulting service. But when you went off to college and you went to Denison, which has a reputation of being a great liberal arts school, what did you think you were going to be doing? What was your career path, at least envisioned when you were leaving high school and going to college?
So before I even applied to Denison, I applied through Denison because my friend who was attending the Harrisburg Academy was going, and we kind of were just like, oh, I'll go with you because we're really close. So I didn't even see myself going to a small liberal arts college. I believe that I wanted to be a psych major, and I was just like, oh, I'll just go to Temple or I'll go somewhere close because financially I was just going to go where they were going to cover everything. Hadn't heard about Denison, but when I went to the overnight with my friend, I was really kind of like, I'll go if you go. And I think that in hindsight, I was like, wow, I really didn't flesh that out. But I went with someone who I trusted, and I knew that I would be able to have a way to come back home. So those are the kind of decisions that when you're living in spaces of need and of a financial hardship, I just made that decision. I wanted to stay close at first, but if there was a place I was going to be able to deliver that, but it was definitely coming from John Harris, which is predominantly urban, to a small liberal arts school in the middle of Ohio. It was a lot of adjustment. And I just remember being like, I really just want to study psychology. I think I had just heard it somewhere. I think it was a job that was going to pay well. And as I started taking the psychology classes, I was like, this isn't for me. So I don't know if it was me feeling like I wasn't academically prepared or what have you, but I took one sociology class and it didn't feel like a course. It just felt like common sense. And someone told me, like, if it feels like common sense, then that's where your passion is. You don't have to feel like, oh, you're studying. It just felt like common sense. I was like, oh, I get this. It clicks for me. And I switched my major over to sociology and was able to double major because I had space to take education courses as well. So sociology and education major because it just clicked and made sense.
Great. So, so why did you come back to Harrisburg? What drew you back to Harrisburg? And what did you see at the time was the reason for coming back here and giving back to the community?
Good question, because individuals that are around my age at that time, the 20 to 30s, have a hard time coming back and staying. We're always consistently delivering the message that we can't wait to get out of here. So I didn't immediately come back, I don't believe. I think I came back for a couple months and was just like, oh, I have to leave for whatever reason, right? And I spent a couple of years, just a couple, literally under two, in Virginia and teaching. And I remember my mother at the time wasn't feeling well, and I was just over there, and I'm like, I'm gonna go home for a little bit. And what a little bit turned into, family planning and being here and raising my family. But I think for me, I realized there's not too many people my age that come back and trying to examine, because sociology had on what's happening, like what is not keeping me here, what is not keeping people, and why is the messaging that we have to go somewhere in order to get the things that we want, the entertainment that we want, the freedoms that we want. Why not create that in the space that in the space that you grew up with? So I think very early on when I came back, I was kind of disheartened because I was like, oh, I feel stuck here. But then you have to examine, like, why do you feel stuck? And if you feel stuck, what can you do about it? So it transformed the way that I thought about committing to the Harrisburg city and just wanting to realize that we have everything that we need here. How do we keep that here, and how do we maximize that in the city? So definitely a change of heart, because I think we're conditioned to think, I can't wait to get out of here. Or people keep saying, like, get your degree so you can get out of here. But how do we transform that message? Because it speaks to the honor that we have, like the Cougar pride and everything. It's misleading to be so prideful about it while you're in it, but then encouraging people to leave. So I had to change my mentality about that. If I'm proud to be a Harrisburg resident all of my life, then being here and transforming it for our kids to be excited about it seemed like it was a commitment for me to do at that point.
No, absolutely. And I think that's true for a lot of people. We share a background in both being teachers, and I certainly thought when I was in college and went on to graduate school that I was going to be a full-time teacher. Never thought there was going to be a political career at the end of that. Always loved books, wanted to get involved in that in some way, but it was really teaching. And when I came here first, I taught in Central Dauphin for a little while, and that experience really helped ground me and connect me, but also show me what it was like to make a difference. Do you remember, when did you first become a little bit more politically active in terms of the biography, and when did you transition from classroom teacher to community engager?
Yeah. So I think there's a difference between community engagement and politically active, right? So I will say I have been politically active for all of maybe a year.
Okay.
Like really actually concentrated. And in some spaces I'm still not, right? So I think that for me, when you teach and you can look at the disparities, that kind of transforms you, if you're an active person, transforms you into a community person that is engaged in community engagement and activism and organizing, because you see that it's much more than, oh, if this person had a book, right? You're understanding, like, oh, children are hungry, and that's connected to grades. It's not just teacher preference or what those things look like or representation. You start to look at it with a fuller lens of, there's so many different components that create the symptoms that we're conditioned to say are the problem, right? So there's hunger, there's poverty, there's opportunity, there's access. And then in changing those things, I think that's when you transition into, or I transitioned into, saying things about it. Because again, when I was in high school, I spoke, but I I didn't command attention under the umbrella of popularity or even movements at that time. I kind of just stayed to myself and really observed and, spoke to people that were close to me. But you observe and you understand systems and you look at how things are happening. And so I began to talk a bit more publicly because Facebook was just kind of that forum where people speak to each other. And I think the voice grew from there as you start, joining organizations. So, joining nonprofits and giving back to the community and volunteering. And once you teach, like you said, you understand layers and you understand the process of giving people knowledge and how powerful that is. And for me, that was me saying, like, there's so much knowledge that needs to be spread in a city format. I felt confined to a classroom, right? Because, teacher regulations and things, and you only have so much time to do so much, and you can't reach parents the way that you kind of want to. So I was like, I think it needs to go beyond a classroom in order to be able to teach what's necessary to shift the different pieces so that it can be reflected through kids and education.
Yeah, I agree. And similar to me. I mean, I think being a teacher, it shows you what's possible. It also shows you some of the immense roadblocks that are there that have to be overcome. And it definitely can inspire you to want to expand the classroom and expand the reach into other things. So talk about your involvement in local nonprofits and how did you expand the classroom into the city at large?
Okay, so again, for me, first coming back, I did a lot of what I would call behind the scenes or ghostwriting work, right? So just sharing, like, hey, I think that this piece might work for this organization, and kind of doing things in a really informal way, right? So wasn't really super formal in the way that I engaged organizations for one reason or another, right? Whether it's because I was family planning and really wanted to devote time to be there full time, and just the schedules of organizations didn't work. But in a really kind of formal and informal mix, I was kind of put into spaces and different meetings where I could share ideas with individuals and it would play out in their nonprofit organization. So I always tell people, just because your name is not directly attached to something doesn't mean that you didn't have an impact on it. So I think on paper and on record, it's harder to find the work, but if you ask or you look into the process of some local nonprofits, you'll be able to kind of identify, or I'm able to identify, like where my hand was in that. From a formal perspective, I'll say that organizations like Bro to Go, I'm passionate about. We just celebrated our birthday yesterday. So 4 years, I've been there for 2, trying to be a part of local chapters of things such as so national organizations that are rooted around Black and Brown communities, the advancement for colored people, and making sure that I'm looking at different organizations that focus on academics as well. But for right now, my formal caseload works under more of the consulting spaces. But from a nonprofit standpoint, right now I'm working with Bro to Go, the reentry program, and then I'm also serving on several boards. So that's how I think the expansion of education and dialogue has kind of been centered for me.
Yeah. And one of the early conversations we had with you and with Bro to Go and the city had to do with the formulation of a Citizens Review Board and the need for that in Harrisburg. You want to talk about your experience advocating for policy change, maybe especially around the issue of community policing and community police relations?
Yes. So much of talking about and thinking about systems has to do with looking at it from both lenses, both as a community, but also knowing that awareness and kind of social change requires policy and procedure movement as well. So there has to be that balance. So what I found is that there were a lot of times where we can talk about the social issues and bringing awareness to that, and awareness and awareness and awareness, and having these drives and having these events. And events are very kind of one time, and they repeat in cycles, but really getting at the heart of something and changing things requires law and policy and procedure movement. So there has to be that marriage between the two. So once you kind of realize that you can only go so far in that kind of social movement space, you start inviting individuals at the table that have that pen power, as I call it, being able to just sign off and get things done so that community leaders can also kind of work collaboratively with individuals to get it done. So my experience with focusing solely on spaces of crime, deviant behavior is my sociology degree and background. I did my senior thesis on the similarities between periods of enslavement and the prison system, and just how individuals, lose their name and are given numbers and just identity and things like that, and the closeness and similarities in those spaces. So advocacy work for me when it comes to criminal and deviant activity is actually very close to home. I had a brother who was in and out of systems and for whatever reason could never really have a long period of time where he broke free of that space. So being able to account through lived experience of why criminal behavior happens, what happens at the core of family dynamics when we talk about criminal behavior. It is not black and white. It's not, oh, this person's a criminal, so the entire family is, right? We have research and lived experience that shows that there's so many nuances and layers and complexities to that. So I think lived experience in that space of engaging crime, punishment, behaviors, mental health, led me into that space. And then formally, as you said, talking about what do those policies need to look like so that they can match what we want as a society and community. So the review board was one of the ones that we had heard the community speaking about loud and clear, but maybe didn't have the education or resources to know how to translate something they had wanted into the space of the city. Because I think that's another problem is
Absolutely.
a national policy, and how do you translate that into the city of Harrisburg, which is unique in demographics, and everything doesn't translate over well, right? So we can't take a policy from Baltimore and bring it here. There's different laws, there's different ways. It's not as easy as saying, I want to duplicate that, but how can we duplicate it in a way that works for our city? So the review board is something that I know many had heard around, and the successes of it happening everywhere, and how do we tailor that to how we need to define success in the city. So I believe we were passionate about that program and brought individuals like yourself in to not only educate the community, but to let us know what our next steps were. And we began that process, which, to my knowledge, was a very long process that had happened, and we picked up and put down and picked up and put down, as with a couple of things, right? So you get passionate about something and then you turn around and you're like, where are we with that? So I know that by the time we had brought it back up, it had been something that had kind of been talked about and then not talked about, and we have to examine why, what fell flat, what didn't work, what isn't going to work, and how do we pick it up and keep the momentum going even after things aren't sensationalized anymore, or after things aren't on the news repeatedly anymore. So when things die down, that's really when the work gets started. So
Yeah, it was a long process, and it involved, I'm sure it was an eye-opener for you in terms of, as you say, taking something which is being much talked about on a national level, translating it into the local realm, building coalitions to get it passed, eventually getting it passed by Harrisburg City Council. And we're not there yet. We still have to populate that board and get it up and running. But it's something I've always supported, and your activism towards that was one of the ways we initially made connection over policy. I think it's also no secret that over the course of last summer, we engaged in a number of conversations about community policing and police reform in Harrisburg, and you were very outspoken and very sharing in your opinion of how we could do things. And so do you want to talk a little bit about how the national conversation over Black Lives Matter and police reform sort of accelerated maybe your community activism here and inspired where we are today, perhaps?
yeah, I would say that you and I have a long relationship. And sometimes when I think about when did we first start speaking? It's outside of what the public has seen us in discourse. So it's definitely important to identify that because our conversations about reform and what things need to look like, and the conversations of, well, did you know this? And then you saying, well, are you this is not how that works, right? So a lot of the education and insight that you've provided from the space of policy and procedure and not just thinking that it's as simple as 1, 2, 3. So you've helped me to identify more of the complexities that I don't think we have if we just don't have a political lens. And again, I did not have that. I had a sociological lens, but not necessarily a political lens. So I think that that conversation helped me to understand the importance of marrying the two. When you're in a space in a city, I think that there are complexities in realizing how important politics are to social movements and how powerful social movements are alone, but how powerful individuals that move into spaces of administration and political movements are. And I think I first started seeing that with Secretary Flood and knowing that this is a person who comes from our community, and we always wish to advance individuals into those spaces. But once we have those people into those spaces, it was interesting for me to observe from our city's perspective how they are managed or assessed, I'll say, and also the weight of the responsibility that individuals like himself and so many others have to create that balance of helping people understand the way that policies and procedures are as they stand and helping both sides see the other side so that there's a fuller lens of how things are interpreted, learned, identified, assessed, so that we can keep that marriage intact to do the work that we need to do. So,
yeah, absolutely. And if we sort of fast forward to where we are today in your new position, we've talked a lot. I've talked a lot about how in Harrisburg we have significant trauma and we have many divisions, and those divisions hold us back in a lot of ways from reaching consensus about all sorts of things, reform, policy, you name it. And one of the things we have to do is engage in uncomfortable conversations and really listen and broaden our perspectives. If we all continue to live in our sort of fractured worlds, we won't really come together. This has been a pleasant conversation here today, but talk a little bit about your vision for what you'd like to see happen here as we move forward with the Community Service Division here in Harrisburg.
I am a fan of difficult conversation because we have to have them, right? And I think that if you live in a space that's a utopia and there is nothing wrong, then absolutely we're filled with comfortable conversations. But discomfort is where we can create change as well. And I think that you and I are an example, I think, of how difficult conversations have to work, in my opinion, by any means necessary, right? So whether I spoke to you face to face, whether I tagged you directly, whether I called you out and you read it and then you would text me like, hey, what is this about? I think that there is something to be said about uncomfortable conversations and the impact of uncomfortable conversations, because it's what has led us here to have this conversation and for you to say, hey, I think you can take this position on, and so many other things. So what I look forward to is creating more spaces that are safe spaces to have those uncomfortable conversations. So once we can have those uncomfortable conversations, we can move into a space of comfort and healing. But we can't, you have to have chaos in order to be that peacemaker. Because if you are just living in peace and there are no problems, then that, I think, is a delusion of reality. So chaos exists, problems exist, trauma exists. There is a very real sickness in this community that transcends outside of just mental health and getting into inpatient or outpatient. There is trauma across culture, trauma across situational things, political trauma, and what that means. We have communities and generations of social dynamics that we are working through, and all of those pieces and the sickness of it all, it doesn't always allow you to have safe and fluffy conversation, right? Especially when the stakes are so high that I think that if it weren't a crisis mode, then there would probably be more patience and desire to kind of keep it down. But I would really consider a lot of those conversations to be crisis mode conversations. So they're not always going to be pleasant, quiet, or short. They're going to be disruptive. They're going to be uncomfortable. They're going to shift and shake and call people to the carpet. And just all of those things are necessary when we're talking about dismantling decades worth, right? We don't have a problem that lasted this week and we should just calmly talk about it. We're talking about 20, 30 years of an administration. We're talking about 10, 15 years. We're talking about 200 years of historical trauma and what that means for so many people that aren't always represented or heard or valued. So I happen to be doing good in those spaces because I have the lens to respond in a way that brings insight to people who may not see it. So what is next for us as a team is to create those different town hall structures where we can bring in different groups that may not feel valued or heard or need that insight and education. What's next for us is being on the ground, listening and educating and engaging. And what's next for us hopefully will be transformative change through programming that helps to heal traumas in these communities.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Anna White. This has been a great dialogue, a great conversation, an example of what we need to do more of in Harrisburg. We've got to talk, we've got to listen, we've got to learn from one another, and we've got to build those connections. And that's what we're going to try and do here on Spotlight HBG for a half an hour live every Friday here on Facebook and Channel 20. I want to thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed our first show, and we'll be back next Friday at noon and every Friday at noon with Spotlight HBG.